All right, everyone. Hello and welcome on this Friday to this wonderful webinar that AHC has scheduled for us today. Today, we are going to be hearing from Victoria Kress and Nicole Stargell, and they're going to be delivering Empowering Those Who Self-Injure, a strengths-based counseling approach. My name is Matt Gonzalez, and on behalf of everyone at AHC, welcome. We are so excited for this conversation that we're going to be having today. Victoria E. Kress, PhD, LPCCS, NCCC, CMHC, uses she, her pronouns, has been a counselor for 3 decades and a counselor educator for over 2 decades. She is the director of the Clinical Mental Health and Addictions Counseling Programs at Youngstown State University. This winter, she will be running to serve as the president of the American Counseling Association, along with Michelle Bradham-Cussar, Carlos Hipólito Delgado, and Ana Flores Locke. She served as a governor-appointed member of the Ohio Counselor, Social Worker, and Marriage and Family Therapist Board, and chaired the Counselor Professional Standards Committee. She has been the recipient of over 50 professional and community service awards, most of which for her advocacy, leadership, scholarship, community service, and mentorship initiatives. She has also received awards for her work with people who have intellectual disabilities, for empowering girls in her community, for her sexual assault prevention efforts, and for her child abuse advocacy work. She has published over 130 refereed articles and book chapters, and she has co-authored 7 books on counseling youth and adults. She has been recognized as one of the top producers and publishers in counseling journals over the past 2 decades. She has served as an editor of the Journal of Mental Health Counseling and as an editorial board member for many counseling journals. She is a past president of Chi Sigma Iota International, the Association for Humanistic Counseling, hello, the Ohio Counseling Association, and the North Central Association for Counselor Education and Supervision. She is a past ACA Midwest Region Chair. She is a current member of the American Counseling Association's Governing Council, and she has chaired or served on 100 plus counseling committees. And today we also have Nicole Stargell, who's a professor in the Department of Counseling at the University of North Carolina at Pembroke. She serves as the department chair, testing coordinator, and faculty co-advisor of the Phi Sigma chapter of Chi Sigma Iota. She is a member of the UNCP Institutional Review Board and the editorial board for Teaching and Supervision in Counseling. Nicole is the editor of the North Carolina Counseling Association's Carolina Counselor, senior chair of the ACA Research and Knowledge Committee, and a member of the Chi Sigma Iota International Excellence in Counseling Research Grants Committee. She earned her master's degree from Youngstown State University in Ohio and her doctoral degree from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, both accredited. Nicole is a licensed clinical mental health counselor, a licensed school counselor, a board-certified telemental health provider, and a national certified counselor. And with that having been said, I will turn it over to our presenters to lead us on such an interesting journey.
Thank you, Matt, for that warm welcome. You have a great voice. Like you enunciate so well. I feel like you maybe need to go into some kind of broadcasting. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. I'm really excited. I was looking at the attendee list and I have some former students and mentees. I have some of my colleagues and friends, and we have an AHC past president, and it's so nice to see old friends and also to see some new faces. So thank you so much for being here today. This is a topic that I am extremely excited to talk with you all about, as is Nicole. So, before we jump in, I just want to talk a little bit about how I came to be interested in self-injury and why we're here talking about this today. Early in my career, I've been a counselor for almost 30 years, and early in my career, I found myself working in a residential facility with children who had extensive trauma and abuse histories. And in fact, that's why I went into counseling, was to try to bring trauma-informed practices to our work as counselors. And I found myself working here, and all of my kiddos had experienced terrible trauma. Many of them had been sex trafficked, some as young as infants. Really, really a lot going on with these kids. And pretty much 100% of them self-injured. And I had no idea what this was. I had not learned about this in school. Nothing I had learned in school prepared me for this. And I really felt in over my head. I wasn't sure what to do. And like a good counselor, I go to the literature and the books and the articles, and there was very, very little being written about this at the time. And I saw the people that I worked with being treated in some really inhumane ways that caused me a lot of concern. And I felt very often like their autonomy was violated, their body privacy was violated. I felt like they were often very misunderstood, judged, criticized, even by our mental health systems, and sometimes even by different mental health providers. And I vowed that when I became a professor one day, I would talk about this and I would try to create spaces to have conversations around this topic of self-injury that were strength-based and empowering and supportive and non-punitive. And so over my career, I've done some research and a lot of writing about how to support this population from a humanistic perspective. At the end of the day, I am a humanist. I'm a past president of the Association for Humanistic Counseling. Thank you for having us here to talk to you today. And thank you to all of you for your membership within AHC. And like all of you, I try to bring a humanistic lens to everything that I do. It's just my meta frame for everything, how I think. And so I'm really excited to bring some of that to you today, and I hope that you leave with an appreciation for how we can think about people who self-injure from a strength-based humanistic perspective. Okay, so here is the QR code. I know that you all have questions. I'm going to reference and talk about a lot of different resources today, and I've created a Google Drive. So if you put your phone up like this and open your camera, it will link you to this drive, and everything that I'm going to reference today is in this drive. There's a copy of this PowerPoint along with some other PowerPoints I've done on the topic of self-injury. All the articles that we've written on self-injury are in there. We have an example of a safety plan that might get you kind of going and thinking about it. We have an example of a self-injury assessment questionnaire that I've constructed based on things that other people have done that is in there. So hopefully this will be a good resource for you as you think about how to approach people who self-injure. And I'm going to also share the QR code again at the end, and I'll also pop the link, the link, the URL to this in the chat at the end. So in case you're having issues pulling up this drive. Okay, so I know that some of you, maybe many of you here, have worked with people who self-injure and have an understanding of the foundations of self-injury. So we don't want to spend too much time going over the foundations of self-injury, but I know some of you may be students or newer to this work and may not have those foundations. So I want to dedicate a little bit of time, but not too much time, to talking about the foundations of self-injury. Um, so what is self-injury? As we're going to be talking about it today, self-injury involves intentional. So it's done with intent. It's not done as part of, like, say, a psychotic process. Intentional tissue damage. So some type of tissue damage to your body that is done without suicidal intent. So there's no intention of attempting or completing suicide when it's done. And the behavior is not engaged in as part of a socially sanctioned institution, right? So people will say, well, what about tattoos and body piercing? Could that be part of a self-injury dynamic? And I say, well, that is an expensive way to self-injure. Most people who self-injure, it's done as part of a body modification process intended to be artistic and self-expressive. So it's different in this way. Um, I'm going to talk a little bit more about suicide in a bit and how self-injury and suicide are unique. So I'm going to get back to that in 1 second. So be patient with that. Who self-injures? There is no clear type of person who self-injures. We often think that women and girls self-injure more than boys and men. And in fact, that does appear to be true if you look at the data, but the data is really focused on people who are help seeking and looking for help and seeking out services, whereas men and boys tend to be less apt to do that. But when you start to get into community samples, you find there's actually not a lot of difference in terms of the prevalence rate in different community samples. In terms of the literature of race and ethnicity in America, I don't think there's enough research to really make any kind of definitive statements about this, but we do know that this is a phenomenon that can cut across all races and ethnicities. In terms of age, we know that adolescents may be a greater risk, with the average age of people starting self-injury being around 13 or 14. So this means our school counselors and people working with youth are playing a particularly important role in terms of self-injury prevention and early intervention. One of the things I say is that most people who self-injure, this will not be a behavior that they continue throughout their lives. And so I find that to be really exciting and really hopeful. And it's something that helps me be positive when I think about my work with this population. One finding that is consistently found across research is that the LGBTQ plus youth are particularly at risk for this. And at ACA this spring, I'm going to be doing a presentation, and I'm working with LGBTQ plus who self-injure. So what are some of the risk factors that may predict this? We know that the ACEs, high ACEs scores, adverse childhood experiences, puts people at risk for all the things: physical health issues, mental health issues, and self-injury is no exception. So people who have experienced child sexual abuse, physical abuse, neglect, witnessing partner violence in the home, family violence, all of these ACEs are high risk factors for self-injury, as well as sexual assaults. And interestingly, something that I've seen a lot is that people who experience a childhood illness may be more vulnerable to self-injuring, which is really curious and interesting to me. I don't know if it's because you develop a complex, problematic relationship with your body at a young age, and then maybe your body becomes a place to manifest feelings and emotions. Uh, we know that people who self-injure have a very hard time identifying their feelings and expressing and communicating their feelings. And so that is something obviously that's going to be a really important, if not maybe the most important thing that we do in counseling, is helping people increase their feeling awareness. And that's very consistent with a humanistic approach and perspective. So why do people do this? Why do people do this? It's so counterintuitive, isn't it? I feel crummy. I feel bad, sad, mad, scared. I'm having all the hard feelings. And so I'm going to um hurt myself, like cut myself, burn myself to feel better. It feels really counterintuitive, doesn't it? So let's take a second to dive in on this. I always say that I think ultimately, the main function of self-injury in my mind is it is an emotion regulation strategy. It's an emotion regulation strategy. So people don't know what they're feeling, how they're feeling, or what to do with it. And so self-injury becomes a way of managing those feelings. And that is, in that way, it is a coping skill. It's not one that we want to encourage or support, but it is a coping skill. And I think that it needs to be honored in that way. Sometimes I get some resistance to my way of thinking from some people who are really amazing self-injury experts who I really respect, but I can't not be a humanist, right? And so to me, I always think, I think about things from a developmental perspective. And so I think, well, you could take away somebody's coping skill, which is self-injury, but if they haven't resolved the things that are causing them to self-injure, they may just pick up another behavior that could even be more dangerous, right? Having multiple sexual partners, for example, can lead to serious STI issues. Substance use, for example. So I really prefer to think of it as a coping skill and an emotion regulation skill. We'll talk more about that in a second. And one of the theories of why people self injure is and Bessel van der Kolk. I'm sure you guys have heard of him. He's trauma person. He talks about how people who self-injure may be reenacting traumas that they have experienced in the past on themselves. I don't like to think of it that way. I don't tend to think of it that way. I prefer my emotion regulation theory. It can be more self-injury can be a form of anti-suicide behavior in that if you're self-injuring to cope, you're coping and you're not trying to end your life. Some people talk about sensation seeking. We can become addicted to anything. And so sometimes there's this addiction model of thinking about self injury. I don't know if y'all are familiar with Gabor Mate, Mate. He's a physician in Canada who talks about trauma. If you're not, as a humanist, you need to immediately listen to some of his podcasts because I would say he's my demigod. He's absolutely amazing and brilliant, and he's such a humanist at heart. And he talks about how 90% of people are addicted to something, and he defines addiction as a behavior that we engage in, a behavior that we engage in to feel better that has a consequence associated with it. So like one of my addictions is this right here. Like, oh, I love coffee and I like put all this horrible sugar-free Cremora stuff in it, which is like toxic sludge. And I know it's probably screwing up my body, but I keep doing it and I gotta stop, right? So I mean that's a silly example, right? But that's one of my kind of addictions, right? So if you can become addicted to coffee with Cremora, right? You know, you can become addicted to all the things. And what he says is all trauma is pain, right? All trauma, are all addictions are caused by pain and trauma, right? So certainly this is the case with self-injury, right? People can definitely become psychologically addicted to it in this way. And certainly there's a physiological component as well, because when someone self-injures, they have a really complex set of physiological reactions that may cause them to want to continue to engage in that behavior. I've worked with a number of people who also self-injure because of dissociation, people who have maybe trauma histories. I've had clients say, I feel real when I see blood. When I feel the pain, I feel real. And that the anger and fear and betrayal and frustration that I'm feeling is mitigated or lessened when I self-injure. It distracts me from that. So that says a lot, right? When someone is so they're hurting so much and they're having such big feelings they don't know what to do with, right? That they would self-injure and physically cause tissue damage because that pain is less than the pain that they're feeling psychologically. That's pretty powerful. Okay, so if there's one other thing I want you to take away today, this is it. Get ready, get ready. Uh, I absolutely go bananas when I hear people talk about self-injury as a form of quote attention seeking unquote. I'm sure many of you have heard that. Um, I started my career in group homes as a teenager. I'm the guardian of a man with a profound intellectual disability, and I started working at group homes when I was 16. I did that for 5 years. And I would have my guys when they would have outbursts. And these are guys who every one of these guys grew up in state institutions since they were born as babies. So they were in state institutions in like, the 50s, 60s, 70s. These are horrific captivity kinds of situations, right? And when they would have outbursts, staff would say like, "Oh, they're just attention seeking. They're just attention seeking." And then I had hoped that that was just specific to working with people with developmental disabilities. Well, no. Then I found myself in counseling settings, and I was hearing counselors and mental health providers say, "Oh, this person's attention seeking." That is our countertransference reaction to them doing things that we don't want them to do. And it's completely unhelpful. The way I choose to think about it, when people self-injure and they display their injuries or they show people and they're seeking help, I prefer to think of it as care seeking is care seeking. So we all have a need for connection and for support. And when you work with people who are in captivity, and by captivity I mean residential treatment facilities, I mean inpatient hospitals, I mean prisons, um, if though these are aberrant situations, like one of the things we know is if you put mice in captivity, put them in a small box, they're not connected with their other mice friends, they're not doing the mouse things, they're not getting to run around and have freedom. What do they do? What do they do? They start to self-injure. Right? So of course, when we have people in captivity, we have to have kindness and compassion and show care and be empathetic to people who are in these situations, which are completely abnormal. Particularly, I spent a lot of time working with children in residential treatment, and many of my kiddos, I had kiddo who was sex trafficked as a baby. Sorry, I'm trauma bombing you. I hope jack out for a second. I'll try to keep it light, but sex trafficked as a baby by her mother. And then she wound up in her first residential treatment at 5. She had foster care disruptions, adoption disruption, and wound up spending pretty much almost all of her teenage years in residential treatment because she couldn't get safe from all the trauma that she had experienced. And she would do a lot of displaying of her injuries because she was in an aberrant environment. She didn't have family, she didn't have support, she had people who were paid to take care of her, and that's completely abnormal. Sorry, I could talk for hours about this, so I'm gonna move on. But please, if you take one thing away, though, take that away. This like way of thinking about people as self-injuring and displaying as a form of care seeking. So, in terms of the stats around self-injury, it's really common. It shocks me even how common it is. I've done some original research, and this is consistent with other researchers across America, that when you go into college samples and you ask students who have self-injured, about 18% say they self-injured at least once. Now, thankfully, most of them haven't done that more than once. Thankfully, but it tells you a lot of people try this as a form of mood regulation, affect regulation. And then I have some stats here for across the globe. You'll see it's similar statistics across the globe. It's really interesting. The most common types of self-injury are cutting, hitting. So this is important. So when, I was talking about gender differences with self-injury, people who do research, and this is what I've done in my research, where you ask about self-injury in terms of like punching walls, head banging, hitting things when angry or frustrated to feel better. We find that boys and men tend to do that more often. So I know people don't often think about that as a type of self-injury, but it is. And so we need to be aware of that. And you might see that particularly in settings where people are in captivity. Pen picking, skin picking, or like excoriation. I wrote an article about excoriation that's also in that folder. Burning, people don't think about burning. I had a client who would exclusively self-injure with burning herself with chemicals like oven cleaner, for example. Swallowing foreign objects. I had a client who inserted, like she was in residential, she had big wounds, and then she inserted a paper clip and she didn't tell me for a week. So by the time she told me and we got her to the doctor, she had bone poisoning. They almost had to amputate her arm. And she knew it was there. It was part of her self-injury dynamic. Okay. So I'm just gonna, in the interest of time, just go over a few things here that I think it's important to kind of be aware of that I haven't mentioned. Uh, Interesting that people who self-injure, about 30%-ish of people who self-injure report that at some point they self-injured more severely than they intended. So this was something I used to kind of minimize when I first started talking about self-injury, but this research is like, yeah, the people who self-injure repeatedly have instances where they self-injure more severely than they intended. So I like to assess for substance use. Do you self-injure while using substances? And do you self-injure when you're dissociating? Because those are two potential risk factors for self-injuring more severely than you may have intended. And then also I mentioned this complex relationship between self-injury and suicide. Again, earlier in my career, I used to be like, look, these are separate behaviors. Look at the definition. They're separate behaviors. But there's more and more research which shows that people who self-injure, that oftentimes they're thinking about death, dying, or suicide while they're self-injuring. And people who complete suicide or attempt suicide, people who self-injure, are at greater risk for completing suicide or attempting suicide, right? So what I suggest is when you work with people who self-injure, it's important that you always do a thorough, thoughtful suicide assessment as part of that. Okay, so let's talk about a strength-based perspective to working with people who self-injure. I love this quote. Martin Seligman is considered the father of positive psychology. He says the most important thing that we learned from all this research and practice, right? The most important thing we learned was that psychology was half-baked. We've baked the part about mental illness, about repair and damage. The other side is unbaked. That's the side of strength, the side of what we're good at. I love that. And to me, that's just like the ultimate humanistic quote, right? You know, there's so little research. Nicole and I and Julie was in Hunt, who's on the call. We wrote an article about humanistic approaches to working with people who self-injure. We actually, it's submitted for review, but we have a book chapter on it, and I don't think I uploaded that, so I'll upload that for you all to see. But in a nutshell, we couldn't find a lot. There really was shockingly little out there in terms of a strength-based or humanistic perspective when working with people who self-injure. But there's tons talking about all the problems and all the psychopathology and all the issues. I would love it if we could change that, right? And talk more about the strengths and resources of people who self-injure and how we can pull those in. A strength-based perspective focuses on thinking about what is the client and the community and the family and the cultural and the school, what are the strengths? What are the resources there? And what kind of capacities are there that we can use in helping this person be their best? It's built around this idea that people are always growing, they're always changing, they're always developing, and we need to hop on that and ride that roller coaster with them. Okay. And here are some different standards for identifying with client strengths. So one of them is we really want to focus on what the client's goals are. And I think this is so important. So one of the questions I get asked a lot is, well, does stopping the self-injury have to be a counseling goal? And in some settings, it does. So if you're in a residential or a hospital setting or like a prison setting, yes, that always has to be the goal because of the nature of the setting that you're in. But when you're working with people in a community setting, an outpatient kind of setting, um, I personally think it's really important to focus on what the client wants to work on. Because as I said earlier, you could work with them to stop self-injuring, but then they may just pick up some other coping skill that is less helpful. So I'm really curious about what the self-injury means to them and what it's about to them. And related to that, I think it's important to focus on their goals. Plus, you really run the risk of rupturing your alliance. If you're pushing them to do something that they don't want to do, you're going to get into an unhelpful power struggle and they're going to feel really misunderstood by you. It's important to also do a strengths assessment, and Nicole's going to talk about that more here in a second, what that looks like. Focusing as well on not just internal resources, but resources from their environment and their institutions that surround them. Um, I think the key to a strength-based approach to working with someone who self-injures is really instilling hope. Look, I've never worked with anyone who continued self-injuring throughout their life. It's typically a phase, a developmental transitional phase that somebody is going through, and I work with them I use language like I assume they're not going to continue this behavior, like this is just a developmental thing that they're going through right now. And then I really focus on choice, right? Consistent with the humanistic perspective, right? We want to focus on choice. Each person is an expert on their strengths and their resources and their hopes. And it's up to them to define that. And we're guides on the side helping them do that. Okay, so some of the principles of a strength-based approach, what receives attention or focus becomes what the client strives for, or their reality, right? So again, this speaks to this idea of hope, strengths, resiliencies. We need to really watch our language and assume change is always occurring. Um, we want to be authentic. We know this as humanists. We always want to be authentic with people who self-injure. So for me, that might look like saying authentically, yes, I don't want you to self-injure because I want you to be kind to yourself and I care about you and I want you to nurture yourself. At the same time, I respect you and I respect that you know what you need to do right now. Right. So just that's authentic for me. Right. No, I don't want anyone to self injure, but I also don't want to control them. Right. So that authenticity is really important. Okay. Talked about all this.
All right. I am going to go over a little bit about strength-based approaches, which is really a big focus of why we're here today. And I just really appreciate this idea that we want to look at this as a resourceful behavior, a coping skill, an attempt to find feelings and emotions and a sense of calm in a otherwise difficult emotional situation. So when we think about self-injury as a coping skill, I really like that frame of mind. And then we can pretty easily bridge that with finding other things that maybe aren't quite as um, I want to say effective, but in a way that's, self-injury is really an in the moment, instantaneous relief for a lot of people who use it. So we can just look to find other coping skills. Also, with that open and transparent kind of conversation around, it's probably not going to do exactly what the self-injury does, but can we find other things, put together a combination of coping skills that help individuals connect with their bodies, feel real, feel sensations, remind themselves that they're alive.
Nicole, I think I talked about all of this. The only thing that I would add here is I didn't mention this, but one of the myths around self-injury that really bothers me is that people who self-injure have severe psychopathology or they're really mentally ill. I've worked with people who self-injure. There's no type of person who self-injures. Yes, I've worked with people with severe psychopathology who self-injure, but I've also worked with super high functioning people who engaged in delicate self-injury who did not have significant psychopathology, right? And another thing is another myth associated with self-injury is that everyone who self-injures has borderline personality disorder. That's not true. As a matter of fact, most people who self-injure do not meet the criteria for borderline personality disorder. But all of these other things I talked about here, Nicole.
Thank you. Okay, so some quick, you can go ahead to the next one. Assessment questions. We're going to go over strength-based assessment questions and then really very practical ones that might veer away from a real humanistic conversation and a non-directive point of view, because as Vicky mentioned, sometimes we do need to be a little bit more directive, depending on the setting, depending on the severity. One thing to highlight on this slide is you'll see the word accident used. And typically, I shy away from euphemisms because I don't want clients to think that I'm judging them or that I'm uncomfortable talking about it. However, it's really important to use the client's language. So if they call it an accident or a mishap or, some other accident does tend to be a common terminology that clients will use. I think it's a really good practice to join with them in whatever language they use. So you can call it cutting or self-injury, whatever, head banging, whatever it is that they're engaging in. But especially when trying to understand it from their perspective, it can be really helpful to use their language. So these are some very concrete things, just really putting context into how we are going to understand the self-injury and the severity. So we want to know how early did it start? And so essentially, when did it start, as well as how long has an individual been free from the behavior? And we're really going to harness that as something of a strength that we can pull on. But we do want to understand, how are you taking care of any wounds? Is it, what's the level of risk for infection, or medical complications? And then one of the more important things is to understand kind of the precursors and the results of the behavior. So trying to find a pattern. When does this behavior typically occur? How are you feeling? What things maybe happen and then, contribute to this desire to self-injure? When we can start to identify the triggers, we can put a safety plan into place that once a client understands what kind of brings them to this behavior, they can identify it before the urge becomes overpowering and implement some of the other healthy coping skills that we identify. And hopefully, as we increase the strengths, then the behavior that is injuring their body will kind of start to fall off. So other information that we would want to know is impulsivity. So is there a period of time where the individual thinks about this or contemplates that, and then when they actually do the self-injuring? And that can contribute to their level of guilt around it. So we don't want to foster guilt, right? We also want to assess how, if they are really thinking about it and spending a lot of time thinking about this behavior, that can increase the guilt. And then the guilt itself can kind of increase the desire to self-injure. So it's probably a conversation that we should have with clients, because it can actually contribute to the behavior itself. So really trying to eliminate and reduce any sort of like guilt or blame or shame in these discussions. We also want to assess, do they have a desire to stop? Do they make efforts to resist it? But again, we want to put this into context that we don't want to increase any sort of guilt or feelings of regret, and because that can kind of contribute to additional negative emotions. Substance use plays a big role. If substance use is involved, then we definitely would want to address that as a treatment goal. And then also, we want to assess for suicide. So I think one myth that is really common is that non-suicidal self-injury is suicidal. And it's right in the title that it's not, but it's hard for people to understand. Why would you injure your flesh and your body if you don't want to kill yourself? We need to believe when clients tell us that they're not suicidal, because again, this is a coping skill. It's an emotional regulation tool. It helps individuals connect with their body during periods of dissociation. So we certainly want to understand that oftentimes this is a behavior that's separate from wanting to die. However, there is somewhat of a relationship, because individuals who use self-injury are also tending to have emotional distress, which is another reason why we don't take away or shame their coping skill, because we don't want them to feel as though they have nothing to live for or no hope. And so there is that relationship between the two. But if we assess for suicide and the client says they're not suicidal, we can believe them.
I'm just watching the time, Nicole, so I'll hop in here with this slide. And just as a side note, we have in the folder the assessment questions, like 4 or 5 pages of questions you can ask people who self-injure. Something that is unique, though, to kind of the traditional questions is this idea of strength-based assessment questions. And this is something that I haven't seen other people talk about that I think is really important. And you'll see these feel really familiar, right? Like these are kind of solution-focused types of questions. So one thing that you might ask people who self-injure is, tell me about a time you were successful in not injuring. In what situations do you find that you don't have the urges to self-injure, or you do not self-injure? What motivates you to not want to self-injure? Who are people you've reached out to keep yourself from injuring? And what is an example of a time you talked yourself out of injuring? What did you say? Did you know you could control that? How were you able to do that? And one of the things I like to say is, I really want you to teach me so that I can help teach other people how to be safe the way you're keeping yourself safe, right? And again, here's a bunch of questions, all the questions. These come from our treatment planning book with the references down there below. We're just doing a 3rd edition update to that right now. So I pulled all of these out and put them in that folder for you. Okay. Was this
This next slide, the real big takeaway here is to be grateful for when our clients tell us about self-injury. I know that it is scary. However, if a client is telling you, they are asking for help, and so they have a motivation to change. And so we have the tools, the resources to address self-injury, and we want clients to tell us. Go ahead forward. So we want to empower clients, use solution-focused principles, and really pull on the client's strengths. Go forward. We can, again, similar to those questions that Vicky just went over, what was different when you were not self-injuring? What usually happens when you find the hope, when you see a different alternative, and really highlighting those strengths and eliciting motivation for different behaviors and different coping skills.
And there's some examples here of just questions that you might ask that I really like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then really identifying strengths. So we've talked about what are, strength-based, and we've talked about eliciting things that are helpful and hopeful. But this is going to be a very concrete list of strengths that you as a clinician can look for in the client and really highlight. So we're going to break them into different categories: individual, your family of origin and support sources, your school and community, and your spiritual strengths. And once you kind of do a strengths assessment, you can really help to build a safety plan that provides clients with a lot of alternatives and helps them to see just all the different ways that they can cope and live a healthier life. So again, you have access to all of this. So, we don't have to go through it word for word, but we've got some individual strengths, and that would be, what are your best traits? What's your, tell me about your sense of humor. Tell me about a time you were able to manage a difficult situation. What are your dreams and hopes for the future? Where do you see yourself in 5 years? Questions like that, really trying to understand clients, places of hope and motivation and desire.
And in the folder, we have, if you look at, there's a file called appendix, and we have just pages and pages and pages of strengths, family strengths, individual, cultural, all of these are in there, and feel free to print those off and use those. I know one of my challenges is, as a strength-based person, is when I ask clients about their strengths, I always get the right? Clients can often struggle to identify their strengths. And so I that's why Nicole and I, we've really pushed ourselves and challenged ourselves to come up with lots of different questions we can use to help our clients identify their strengths and to help us do it too.
Yeah. And if we just kind of roll through, we've got examples of spiritual, community strengths, and you can find all of those in the QR code.
Okay, so if we were together in person and if we had time, what I would do is break you all up into dyads, so two folks together, and I would have you share a time when you accomplished something that you consider to be a success. Share a time that you accomplished something that you consider to be a success. And what I would do is I would have your partner listen to your story for a few minutes, listen to your story, and write down on Post-it notes or stickers or file folder stickers all of the strengths that they heard you apply to be successful in that situation. I'd really like to invite or encourage all of you to do that, this weekend with a partner, with a friend, with one of your kiddos, family member. It's a really, really powerful exercise. And it's an important exercise because what it does is it trains our strength-based listening ear, right? So often when we listen from a place of what's the problem, what's wrong. And this is a way you can strengthen that ear and use that hopefully with all of your clients, right? Across the board. It's a really powerful activity and I get really great feedback on it. I wish we could do it together, but we don't have time and we're not together. So that's a bummer. Okay, so what are some of the safety considerations related to working with people from a strength-based perspective? As I mentioned, there's a safety plan in the folder. As part of a safety plan, you don't want to do contracts. I mean, that's like so 1985, right? We don't do contracts anymore. We talk about safety planning. And I use language like, I care about you being safe. And it's so important to me because I care about you that I do everything I can to help empower you to be as safe as possible. So let's talk about what that might look like. And as part of that, you might think about having the client identify their triggers, or what are the triggers that precipitate them having an urge to self-injure. You might talk with them about the physical cues. So how do they know in their body, what kind of thoughts do they have that are suggesting self-injury situation might be emerging? And then what are some of the reducers, or what are the things they do to manage or prevent the self-injury? You might also talk with them about exploring safe people and safe places that they can go to. And here's where those strength-based questions we threw out earlier could be really helpful. And you might talk about with them about how they can avoid contacts with things that they use to self-injure. Okay, gotcha. So I want to take a second to talk about replacement behaviors. Replacement behaviors are behaviors that you engage in instead of self-injuring. So you replace the self-injury behavior with another behavior. So a lot of times people will talk to me about negative replacement behaviors. A negative replacement behavior is a behavior that is kind of like self-injury-ish, but it doesn't cause as much damage, right? So people will say, well, should I tell my client who self-injures to snap themselves with a rubber band instead of cutting themselves? Or instead of burning themselves, should I have them hold an ice cube in their hand to create the sense of a physical sensation without the tissue damage associated with like using oven cleaner or something like that, right? Um, I think it's kind of controversial. From a strength-based perspective, if a client thinks that would help them, or if they suggest that as something that has helped them in the past or maybe helpful, I think it's okay to do that. I don't generally encourage negative replacement behaviors. I really try to focus on behaviors that they can use across the board in all settings that they're in. And so, like, for example, if they're at school, they may not be able to have an ice cube to burn themselves, right? But they can work on breathing exercises, mindfulness activities, changing their thoughts, right? Or they may go to somebody to talk to them for support instead of self-injuring themselves. So I tend to encourage more positive replacement behaviors. So, and this might also include things like distraction. So distracting yourself from the current situation as a way of coping. Maybe playing with silly putty. Maybe instead of using an ice cube to burn yourself, you might use like rub vitamin E or lotion on your skin where you want to self-injure. One question that you might ask your clients who self-injure is, develop a list of 10 activities that you've used in the past to help keep you from self-injuring or to help you manage self-injury. So that's a solution-focused kind of question that you might use, and have them write those down. And then you can also pull those into their safety plan as well. So I know you're all hungry for activities you can use with your clients Monday morning at 9 a.m. So Nicole and I have pulled together a few activities that are strength-based activities that you might find helpful. This is one of my favorite activities. I use it with people all the time. And this is the older, wiser self letter. And what you do is you ask the client to imagine that they've grown to be an older, wiser them, and they're looking back at this time in their life. What advice would your older, wiser self give you about how to navigate this phase of your life? What would they tell you to remember as you move forward? Um, what would they suggest that would be most helpful in helping you be your best, heal, move forward, maybe keep the self-injury influence at bay? What would they say to comfort you? How would they tell you to take care of yourself and nurture yourself? Be kind to yourself right now. And then we have a few other activities that are detailed here. So I'm not going to go over these, but one's a strengths tree activity where they draw a tree and then the leaves on the tree are various strengths or coping skills or resources or supports that they have. And we have some detailed directions here for what that activity might look like. In the folder, I've also co-authored some articles on using creativity as an intervention with people who self-injure. People who self-injure have a hard time identifying and expressing their feelings. And so I think creativity and expressive arts interventions can be especially powerful. And so there's some different activities in there that you may find to be helpful. Okay, so I want to go back to, here's my email address, Victoria E as in Elizabeth Kress @gmail.com. So if you have questions or want to consult on anything ever, feel free to reach out to me. And then I want to go back over the QR code. So here's that QR code again. And oh, whoopsie daisy, what happened there? And what I'm going to do as well, as I promised, is there's the QR code again. I'm going to pop the link in the chat to the QR code. But to do that, I have to exit out. So, okay, with that said, I know we have a few minutes for questions. I have to pop out right at 1 because I have a group supervision. But I'm wondering what questions or comments folks have. And I'm also curious about what people are doing to approach people who self-injure from a strength-based perspective in their worlds, in your worlds.
And we had a question from Edna in the chat about engaging the legal medical system. So I would say that, when the law mandates that we, report, then we definitely would have to do that. And aside from that, hopefully we would be able to, create a safety plan and really stick to our ethics of confidentiality.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked about that because I get asked that question a lot. And we've also written some articles about ethics issues associated with counseling people who self-injure in there. And I've also, I actually just did a presentation on that, a webinar on that last week that I think it was recorded. I'm not sure if it was recorded. I know I did one for sorry, I've been doing so many presentations, I can't remember them all, but I think I have a recorded one on that. But we also wrote some articles, and those articles are in the folder. But legal and ethical issues come up all the time around self-injury, and I encourage people not to overreact. So if someone is engaging in controlled self-injury and they have no intention of suicide, to violate their confidentiality, to try to force hospitalization on them is going to rupture the therapeutic alliance. So you have to be really, really careful about that. And to that end, just being aware of your own emotions and your own, look, we all have countertransference, right? I don't want any of my clients to self-injure. It's normal to have a reaction of like, I don't want you to do this. So just being aware of it and honoring it and consulting and thinking about how to respond is really helpful, and it really protects you as well. But I have seen over the years people violate confidentiality because they panic, and that's not helpful. So thank you for asking that question.
Yeah, you always want to consult. What is the most important lesson you have learned about working with clients who self-injure?
That's a good question. I mean, I guess I just go back to kind of what I said is that a lesson I've learned is that a lot of the mental health system and providers uh, overreact when people self-injure, and it really ruptures the relationship. So I can't tell you how many people I've worked with who have been hurt by the system or other providers. So I think just, again, if you're not sure about hospitalization, if you're not sure about violating confidentiality, consult, ask people. I guess so. I guess I'm kind of saying, like, I think one of the most important lessons is like we need to be aware of and control our reactions and attempts to control people, because that in my experience that really backfires.
Yeah. Yes. a balance between, you know, doing what we ethically and legally have to do, and then being supporting client autonomy.
Yes. And also this idea of harm reduction. I see Justin Jordan is here, and I'm dying to write an article with Justin about harm reduction and self-injury. So we talk about harm reduction in substance use, but we don't talk about it in the context of self-injury. And I do think that harm reduction can play an important role in how we approach people who self-injure.
Absolutely.
Yes. Are there any other questions that we missed?
Thanks to you all. It's wonderful to have you here. Yeah, there's an article about school counseling, and I think that that would be a good place where parent relationships are addressed.
Yeah, in the folder, we have an article on school counselors and self-injury and ethics issues. And then we also recently co-wrote an article on schools and developing policies around self-injury. I encourage all schools to develop a policy around managing self-injury. So we have some guidance in there as well that you might find helpful, particularly in the schools. You got to have a plan to know how to
Mhm.
respond to that. You can be caught
Yeah.
in the wind.
Thank you, Julia.
Thank you
Wonderful.
all. Thank you all. Thank you. And thank you again to AHC for hosting this. Thank you all to being members of AHC and for being humanists and for fighting the good fight to make sure that we don't lose the humanity in the work that we do with our clients and students. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, thanks so much once again with Dr. Kress and Dr. Stargill's wonderful presentation today. We are always so glad to be able to host such wonderful presentations, and I am sure I am speaking for everyone when I say we were not disappointed whatsoever. So thank y'all so much. I know that Vicky, you've got to hop off in just a moment, and if any additional questions are coming up, we can feel free to ask them now. But without too much further ado, we are beginning to wrap up here. So thank y'all so much for spending some time with us and bringing in some wonderful resources and knowledge. Thank y'all.
Thanks, everybody. Bye now.